Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Swails, Secretary Topper, thank you for being here today. And Secretary Topper, if I may, would like to pick up on a conversation we had last year about the Agile contract. And can you give me a status update on that project? Specifically, Mr. Secretary, since the Agile contract has been awarded, would like to know how many contracts with third parties have been inked, for what they have been inked, and how much revenue has been generated to date on third-party leases.
Senator, I'll be happy to send you the details offline. I don't have all of the details on the numbers of contracts or the pipeline right in front of me. I can share with you that the first check arrived at the Commonwealth last month, and we're very pleased to finally start building some momentum here with these agreements.
Can you please remind me again how much the third-party entity will be provided as a result of these contracts?
There are varying percentages depending on the where in the agreement we are, but I believe there's a revenue split for the proceeds of the contract. Forgive me because I'm looking for the details as I speak to you. I believe we've already provided the details of the contract, Senator, but I'll be more than happy to provide them to you again.
Well, and this might be a question for Secretary Swails. Where do those revenues get deposited?
I don't think that's a good question for Secretary Swails. I don't know the answer to that, so I'll have to get back to you.
Well, I thought Secretary Swails was the knower of all, so I will look forward to a response back as to where exactly those revenues are deposited. And Secretary Topper, while you acknowledge that rural broadband deployment will take significant investment, we don't really know at this point where those revenues are being deposited, but doesn't it make sense to deposit all revenue generated through the leasing of state-owned assets to third-party wireless and broadband providers into the Rural Broadband Infrastructure Fund that was created through Act 132 of 2020?
No, Senator, I don't agree that it makes sense to deposit all of the proceeds from the leases that we put in place into that fund. I believe there are significant expenses that the agencies incur, that the state government will incur in order to maintain that equipment and in order to maintain those agreements, and there should be funds from the proceeds of the leases set aside in order to pay for that maintenance. I also believe that a portion of the funds should be allowed to flow back to the agencies whose property is being used for the purpose of erecting new towers and new equipment. Without that incentive, it is much more difficult for us to drive the agreements that are necessary between agencies in order to be able to identify, successfully market
So essentially this
assets.
contract is for the purpose of monetizing state-owned assets to put back into the general fund spending of these departments, as opposed to what you had originally professed, which was to further deploy broadband. And
Senator, you're mistaken. I never originally professed that.
Very interesting, because that's not exactly how I recall the conversation, and we've had several conversations over time. I will tell you that I asked your colleague, Secretary Davin, and I know he perhaps was not pleased with my question, but I have to ask you this. We continue to hear that the administration wants to prioritize broadband expansion to unserved and underserved areas. The contract that you entered into, and I requested the proposals from all three of the bidders. To date, I've only ever seen one. It was very heavily redacted. it's only adding costs to market state-owned assets that you have to put money back into the contract, and we're not getting any additional bang for our buck in closing the digital divide in the most unserved and underserved areas. And I have horror stories from rural areas like Forest County, where a carrier is looking to site a tower on state-owned property only to walk away because the quote from the third-party middleman that you hired through this contract is too high. So, Mr. Secretary, you're not going to make money on deploying broadband in areas that are not currently served by high-speed internet. You're going to make money putting a tower on top of the Keystone building here in Harrisburg, or in buildings in Philly and Pittsburgh, but not a state police barracks where the population of deer is greater than people, but where we really need to have those connectivity for the people. So on one hand, you're saying broadband deployment is a priority. On the other hand, your opposition to legislation that would make that happen, and your inking of this contract is really preventing us from deploying broadband in a meaningful way. And to use revenues from a 20-year third-party contract that isn't going to help close the digital divide surely makes me question the commitment. So mixed messages are very frustrating, and I certainly would hope that we'll be able to come together and work on legislation like my Senate Bill 442 to help us see where the opportunities are to deploy broadband in unserved and underserved areas and make that a reality for every Pennsylvanian. So if I could turn to working from home, Senator Ryan Allmett and I have proposed to consolidate the state's information technology efforts under one roof. If our IT spending was a state agency, it would be the fourth largest entity just behind Human Services, Education, and Corrections. We spend over $1 billion a year in our IT. This pandemic has thrust our reliance on our information technology systems to the forefront, and we have major challenges. So I have heard from whistleblowers who have told me that state employees did not receive laptops or computer equipment to carry out their jobs until August of last year, nearly 5 months into the governor's orders to require state employees to work from home. How did employees who did not have computers complete their work and ensure that they were being good stewards of taxpayer dollars and completing their assigned mission while working from home?
I'm sorry, Senator, was that a question for me or for Secretary Swails?
It is a question for you, Secretary Topper.
Okay.
And if you're not able to answer that, I would appreciate a response from Secretary Swails.
Well, I'll do my best, Senator, but frankly, it's difficult to answer a question without the details behind what you're suggesting. Certainly, it wasn't the case in my agency that employees who were teleworking waited until August before they had the necessary equipment in order to telework. I don't know to what extent the premise of your question is correct. Much like your characterization of the wireless contract, it's incorrect.
Well, who in fact is in charge of each agency, each department's information technology?
The Office of Administration, Office of Information Technology is where the Commonwealth CIO sits, and they have primary responsibility for IT policy.
And are they in charge of deploying computers and laptops to every state employee, or is that the responsibility of Department of General Services?
It is not. The Department of General Services is responsible for maintaining contracts that make it possible for the agencies and the Office of Administration to procure the equipment that is necessary.
So ultimately, who is responsible to assure that every employee has the necessary information technology, hardware, and software to complete their job?
Ultimately, it's the responsibility of each agency to ensure that their employees are equipped with the tools they need to do their jobs. We support the agencies in that effort by providing contracts
So when
and
an employee
relationships with
of
contracts.
the Department of Banking or the Department of Environmental Protection or the Department of Insurance or the Department of whatever doesn't get a computer to do their job, then where does the buck stop?
Well, Senator, honestly, it depends. It depends on whether was it an instance where the contractor was unable to provide because they didn't have the laptop in stock. Was it the case that the agency involved, in your example, if the Department of Banking had for some reason failed to put in the correct purchase order in order to procure the equipment in time? There are many steps along the way between identifying a need and having that need met, but the Department of General Services is not ultimately responsible for deploying technology in agencies across the Commonwealth. That's just not how the system works.
Well, it's good to get your perspective that you're not responsible for that, and we'll circle back with the other agencies, departments, and ask those questions and see the response that we get from them as well. With regard to software licensing, who's responsible for that? Is that through the Department of General Services, or is that through each department and agency?
Software licenses are typically negotiated by a team combined of professionals from the Office of Administration, OAOIT, and DGS.
So if I could, each workstation for every state employee has software licensing attached to it. Now employees in many of the state agencies and departments haven't touched their workstations in over a year. Have you been able to renegotiate those contracts to save on software licensing?
Senator, typically the terms of a software license don't allow for you to go back and renegotiate in the fashion that you're talking about. It'd be helpful to know what you mean. Like I suspect you're imagining an opportunity that isn't really there.
Mr. Secretary, having negotiated contracts for many of the similar types of things on a much smaller scale, as a school board director, we always put clauses in there to protect ourselves. Are you not negotiating clauses to protect the taxpayer and the Commonwealth in your software licensing contracts?
Of course we are.
Well, I would think that for the tremendous number of desktops and laptops that this Commonwealth has, one, I would look for financial savings, and two, I have great concerns about the security of laptops and desktops who have not been turned on in well over a year, and the potential exposure from a safety perspective, a cybersecurity perspective, if there's not a process in place to do this systemically and in a way that protects our cybersecurity when you turn those back on, since they haven't had any patches or updates in well over a year, unless that's something you think I also don't know about. So,
final comment.
Secretary Topper, in your budget, you're seeking a 20% increase in rental, relocation, and municipal charges, as well as a 2.8% increase in utility costs. And to the taxpayers that I represent, they know most state employees are not working in their state offices. They are, in fact, working from home. They've tried calling those offices. They're getting busy signals. They can't get through. Everything's being done over the email. And I look at your budget for your energy costs in particular, and I'm scratching my head at what possibly that increase in cost could be attributed to.
Well, Senator, forgive me, the impact of the pandemic on our utilities costs is a little bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's true that with some, that with fewer people in our buildings, we have reduced some of our electricity consumption, for things like laptops and desktops, et cetera. On the other hand, we've had, as a safety precaution, we've had to increase the ventilation in all of our buildings, and we've been running the buildings less efficiently than we would normally have run them in order to increase the airflow as a COVID precaution. So it's not automatic that having fewer people in the buildings would automatically lead to lower costs to run the buildings. We have actually, I'm not certain what increase you're referring to, but I'd be happy to get you a breakdown of the line items associated with our utilities costs. Also in there, I believe, is excess property insurance and a handful of other things that represent the lion's share of the increase.
Well, I would appreciate the information with regard to your energy usage, and also some information about information technology, software licensing, as well as the Agile contract. And the list is long, and we'll have staff follow up with all of the things that you have promised to provide today. Thank you very much. Secretary? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.